Hi, my name's Steve and welcome to the Seaside Allotment channel. And this is my top 10, probably end up being 12 tips for productive gardening. So I'll start with grow the right things. And the first kind of sub tip in this is to grow the things that you like, which is pretty obvious, although I do see quite a lot of people growing things that everybody else is growing, and so they think they should grow them as well, or they grow them because they seem to grow well on an allotment, and I think it's just worth really doubling down on trying to grow the things that you like, provided of course that they're suitable for this climate and the amount of time and effort that you're prepared to put into gardening. But there's a real reason that I mentioned this one, and that is that there's quite a few things probably that you don't like, but when you eat them fresh off the plot, organic, etc., you're going to really love them. And that was definitely the case for me. So many things that I eat now I didn't think I liked when I was getting them frozen or from the supermarket. For example, I can't stand frozen cauliflower, I can't stand frozen calabrese, broccoli, but I love them fresh. I can't stand frozen peas, but I love them fresh. So there's lots and lots of things that are really mainstays of my diet now that I didn't think I liked until I started growing them myself. So the second thing is grow the stuff that's sprayed the most if you buy it commercially. It's kind of worrying when you see how much pesticide residue there is on fruit and veg these days. So we make sure that all the strawberries, for example, that we eat, we grow ourselves. All the preserves that are made from fruit and berries, we make those preserves ourselves. Carrots are an interesting one. Carrots are so cheap from the supermarket, but they're also one of the most frequently sprayed of vegetables. So we try to always make sure that we're self-sufficient in carrots. Kale, I was surprised that kale is sprayed quite so much. And obviously kale is kind of a mainstay of allotment gardening, so definitely one to grow. I've just done a video on kale actually, so check that one out. Potatoes, obviously sprayed a lot for blight, but other things as well. You take the risk when you grow them on the allotment that you're going to get blight as well, especially if you grow it organically. But I think it's worth the risk to be able to get a good source of organic potatoes. Tomatoes, obviously, they're sprayed no end, and apples, pears, celery, cherries, lots of stuff that grows fantastic on an allotment. So next thing is grow the stuff that you can't buy in the shops. And I've got a few examples here, but everybody will probably have their own lists here. We grow a lot of chard. We think it's an amazing cooking green. It's great in smoothies. It's pretty good in salads. Cucamelons, we really like those. We use those as a kind of crunchy addition to salad mixes. They don't taste exactly like cucumbers, and they don't taste anything like melons, but we use them as a radish alternative in summer. Oca is a fantastic root vegetable, really colourful and crunchy, and incredibly kind of fresh tasting. A really lovely radish alternative in winter, although you can cook with it as an alternative to potatoes and things as well, but I just don't think you can beat it fresh. Golden purslane, that's probably the most popular salad ingredient that we grow. People absolutely love it, but you just can't get it in the shops. It's amazing, so definitely try golden purslane. And New Zealand spinach, if you like spinach but you're fed up of spinach bolting in the summer, grow New Zealand spinach, and then you'll never have to go to the supermarket again in summer. Grow things that taste better grown and eaten, grown on an allotment organically and eaten fresh. Some great examples of that: tomatoes, spring onions, sweet corn, mulched peas. As I said in the introduction, there'll be lots of things probably that you think you don't like, but when you taste them homegrown, you'll love them. Grow things that are expensive but prolific. These are the things that are really going to pay all your costs on the allotment, and be a significant part of your diet as well, because they're just so prolific. Forget about potatoes and onions, if you haven't got the space, and instead grow things like lettuce, spinach, tomatoes, New Zealand spinach, kale, sprout leaves and field bean tops in winter. They're just amazing. The value that they deliver per square metre is just outstanding. I think probably some of those things are delivering 50, 60 pounds in money, in UK pounds, per square metre, which is just amazing. 1 square metre is paying all the rent for the allotment for the year, for example, from some of those veggies. So the next thing is plant lots of trees. I think although it's a bit of an investment in time, just it's such a fantastic thing to see, this little tiny area of ground deliver such an abundance of riches in terms of fruit. We're particularly partial to cherries and plums and apples and pears, but there's so many different trees that you can plant, and they're great. And we also grow kind of the tree kales, some of the perennial tree kales. They look like trees, so they're quite nice in a back garden setting, but they're just all leaves, no fruit. And trees just they really do deliver on the time and that you invest in them. So definitely put some trees in as soon as you get your allotment, and then in 3 or 4 years' time you'll be so pleased you did. So the next thing is kind of controversial, because it's a kind of tip that doesn't always make sense for everybody in all circumstances, but it's definitely worth considering, and that is to start with raised beds. Now, why start with raised beds and not finish with raised beds, for example? Well, I think that when you're starting out on an allotment, often you're inheriting a mess, and if you can kind of level an area, put in a raised bed and bring that area under control, so put in your raised bed, fill it with compost, put wood chips all the way around it, or grass it, or whatever you want to do, and say, yep, I've got that part done, and then move on to the next part and gradually chip away at bringing your allotment under control. And raised beds are just a great way to do that and help you kind of achieve that psychologically. And I've seen lots of people on this site do that, gradually sort of start at the front and gradually work their way backwards. And the parts that they've got with raised beds are all sort of under control and well managed, and motivate you to come down and enjoy time on your allotment, and then you can sort of gradually move the boundary further on. So psychologically they're great, and they're great for clearing up as well, because if you're like me, and I just like coming down to the allotment for half an hour a day, or just pop down in the morning or pop down in the evening or something like that, it's just great because you can get a job started and finished in that half an hour period. You can clear the bed, you can weed it, and you can re-fertilise and mulch it and get it all ready for planting, and probably even get it planted in half an hour to an hour. And that's just, psychologically it's just so rewarding. The next thing is, it's just a great way of overcoming the challenge of weeds. A raised bed full of compost, and what we tend to do is fill the bottom half with well-rotted horse manure and the top half with spent mushroom compost when we're starting a new bed. That 6 inches will suppress and kill almost all the weeds, apart from bindweed and mare's tail, which there's not much you can do with those other than just keep digging them out as they come up. But for most of the stuff, maybe put cardboard down at the bottom, but for most of the stuff it's just a great way of establishing a clean growing area. And then because it starts clean, it's relatively easy to keep it clean as you go. So I really like them for that purpose. And obviously if you're putting that much compost down, it's kind of hard to maintain your boundaries until all that compost has kind of settled down and you've got many years of wood chips kind of built up on the other side. And then probably by the time you get to the time those beds need replacing, that's a good time to reconsider the way you've designed your allotment, and maybe put in bigger raised beds, or remove the raised beds altogether and just go for shaped sides, still raised because it's great for drainage, and as I said, it's great for mulching and weed suppression and feeding the soil and all those other benefits. But you don't necessarily need wooden sides once you've got everything sorted out, once you've got all your paths established and weed free, once you've got all your beds established and weed free, once you've had many years of compost and the compost is now deep down, worms have taken it deep down into the soil. You don't need quite as high raised, and so it's easier to shape the bed without a wooden side. Anyway, rambled on about that a bit. So if you do go for raised beds, make sure you standardise your sizes. So we have a very large size, which we use for things like the main crop brassicas, the squash, things like that. And then we have a medium size, which we use for things like the onions and the shallots. And then we have a small size that we use for things like the salad beds, things like that. And it's nice to have those standard sizes because it means you can build structures to put on top of them. We have a lot of coal frames and load tunnels that we can move around the site to wherever we need them, because all the beds are the same size. So that's really great. It also means you can standardise on everything else basically. So you can standardise your net sizes. We have panels that we put on the ground when we're germinating the carrots made from hessian. So we can, they're all the same size as the raised beds, so we can just lay those down whenever we're starting carrots. Everything basically can be standardised and reused. It also makes planning really easy because you know how many seed trays you need for the number of raised beds that you've got, things like that. So just lots of benefits from standardisation. I'm a massive fan of mulching with compost. Charles Dowding has said everything you need to say about the benefits of no-dig beds, so I won't say any more. I'll just say I agree with Charles Dowding, it's fantastic. Mulch your beds with lots of compost and you'll never look back. Lots less weeds, feed the soil, protect the soil, it's just great. So next thing is grow in modules rather than direct seed for most crops. Obviously you are going to direct seed your parsnips and your carrots and a few other bits and pieces, but wherever you can, grow in modules. And there's all sorts of benefits from this, but I think the best benefit is that it means that you're not wasting time. The ground isn't occupied by seeds that are waiting to germinate and then growing to this sort of size, and that can be 6 weeks. So the ground is occupied for those 6 weeks, but it's not at all productive. Whereas if you grow in modules, those 6 weeks, a bit of time for germination and then grow into planting out size. Sometimes it's 4 weeks, sometimes it's 6 weeks. That time they're not in the ground. They're in a high density place like shelves in a greenhouse or something like that, or windowsills at home or whatever. So it means that once they're in the ground, they're not far away from being actually productive and you start harvesting them. Now, in practical terms, what that means is that you probably get a whole extra succession out of your beds. And for us, we grow about 40 pounds of fruit and veg per square metre on our allotment, 40 pounds UK pounds. And so you're getting about an extra 10 pounds. So one extra succession, because we do 3 to 4 successions a year of harvest. And that definitely adds up. I mean, it certainly pays for the module tray and the tray that it's contained in. So that might cost you, say, £1.50 or something like that. But you're getting an extra £10 harvest. So, and that module tray is going to last 2 or 3 years. So it financially it's just great. It means you grow lots more food as well, and you get less damage from pests, particularly slugs. Slugs really like eating tiny seedlings, but they're not so keen on reasonably sized plants. And it means that everything's just easier, because basically you're planting out known good plants as well, so there's less thinning required. You don't end up with gaps in the bed. You can grow spares and keep those spares for a few weeks, just in case something doesn't establish very well. So I highly recommend starting with modules. So manage your successions. I think this is one of the absolute key things in gardening, is you've got to try and get 3 or 4 successions out of every piece of ground. That's what we typically do. It's not always possible. So for example, in the polytunnel where I am now, some of the beds only get 2 successions, so they might get tomatoes and salad crop in winter. Some of them will get 3 successions, but so some that are getting at the moment, for example, what I'm looking at has salads all over winter, so autumn and winter. As we're coming to the end of winter now, we're planting brassicas in there. Those brassicas will be harvested in May, and then peppers will go in there, and then those peppers will be harvested, and then salads will go in. So we're getting 3 successions in the polytunnel beds. But in most of the beds outside, I'm looking to get 3 or 4 successions, and that includes probably an interplant as well. So I might interplant radish, I count that as a succession, so there might only be 3 plus the radish. The exceptions to that are probably the winter brassicas, because they stay in for the whole year, but they're so incredibly productive. They're like an endless succession anyway, because you start off eating the leaves, and then you eat the main crop, whatever that is. Let's say it's colettes or sprouts or something, and then you can start eating them when they start flowering as well, and eat the flowers. So you're kind of getting 3 successions. So if you do your successions right, you can probably double your harvest. And in our case, we harvest about £10,000 worth of food off 250 square metres of growing area. That excludes all the paths and compost bins and water butts and all of that sort of thing. So it's a lot more than that, 250 when you add all that in. And so we'd only harvest about 5,000 if we only did, say, 1 or 2 successions a year. So it makes a big difference to the financial viability of your allotment and the amount of food you can grow. So the next one, which also increases the amount of food you grow, is to interplant. And that takes advantage of the fact that there's a lot of empty ground at certain times of the life cycle of a plant. So when you plant a little lettuce plant, it's this size, but it's in a space that's this size. And so you can interplant with radish, for example, which will be harvested before the lettuce needs the full amount of space. Or you could interplant, and this is my favourite, with spring onions. You plant spring onions that are a bit more mature, a few weeks older than the lettuce, and then by the time the lettuce is finished, you've also harvested all the spring onions. And because spring onions are planted in a clump like this with, say, 9 seeds in a single module, they don't take up much space. And then the root zone of those spring onions kind of spreads out to be about like that, which is about touching the root zone of the lettuce that it's interplanted with. So you've basically just got a continuous mat of roots, which is quite nice. What else do I like interplanting? Well, I really like planting the edges of beds, because often there's all that goodness in the path that you're not taking advantage of. We cover our path with wood chip. That's sort of that much wood chip. At the bottom it's compost. That compost is feeding the soil, but nothing's growing in that path, hopefully, if there's no weeds there. And so by planting the edges of the beds quite intensively, they are getting access to the water underneath the path and the goodness underneath the path. That's really useful. So we'll often plant, for example, garlic all the way down the edges. We'll plant spring onions, we'll plant onions, radishes, carrots, a single row of carrots all around the edge of something. And if you do that right, you want the same sort of protection, obviously, over it. So if you've got, say, like your winter brassica bed, and that's got an enviromesh net over it, then it's great to put the carrots around the edge where they're going to get light, so they're going to grow there quite happily, and then you can just sort of lift your enviromesh up, grab a bunch of carrots, grab it out, close it again, no carrot fly gets in, no butterflies get in, and both of them are enjoying the same protection from pests that the enviromesh provides. So that's interplanting, but you can really mess things up if you kind of go a little bit overboard on interplanting, and if you get your timings wrong, or you get the sorts of things that you're interplanting wrong, and you can end up with a situation, and it's happened to me many times, where I've planted something and it's overwhelmed the other crop, and so I've only got half the crop that I was expecting. And particularly if the interplant is not very high value, but the main crop is really high value, let's say it's lettuce interplanted with radish, but you put too many radish in, for example, and they're too big, and they overwhelm the main crop lettuces, which aren't growing big enough yet. That's a kind of real disaster. The other sort of disaster with interplanting is where your main crop plant overshadows the interplant and doesn't get enough light, or where the interplant hasn't matured and been harvested by the time your main plant has been harvested, and so you end up with the interplant sort of occupying loads of space in the bed, and you're waiting for it to mature, when you could, of course, have replanted with another main crop. And that's happened a few times for me, and often with spring onions. So I put spring onions in at the wrong time of the year, or not mature enough, and so we end up with these little tiny spring onions, this sort of size, but I've harvested everything else. But I just don't want to pull those spring onions up, and I should really, and I should just get the whole bed replanted. And that does lead me to the next tip, which is kind of be for successions, which is to be ruthless. You really do. If you want to get 3 or 4 successions, you've got to, be ruthless in managing those dates. It's sometimes quite painful, because you can have a productive bed there, and you can be thinking, well, should I just leave it and leave it and leave it? And by the time you've made your decision and decided, yeah, I'll pull that bed up, actually there's not time to get that next succession in. Whereas you'd be much better off, cutting your losses, getting 80% of the harvest, composting 20% of it, clearing the bed, getting another full harvest out of it. So, when you do your plan, you've got to stick to it, or either change it and put something with a shorter life in. So that, that's the other option. So I just mentioned a couple of other interplants that I really like. I have coal frames. I really like the fact that the back of the coal frame is kind of the most protected and sunny spot, and so we put things like peas at the back of the coal frame. They only take up that much space, and so really, you're not losing any of the coal frame. And so we've planted peas now. They're growing away at the back of the coal frame. We take the coal frame tops off in April. By then the peas are nice and big and ready to be start going on up their frames, which we have the frames in, obviously, after we've taken the coal frame top off. We really like interplanting, I've forgotten what it is, sweet corn into the squash beds, and that's fantastic because obviously the squash plants are very widely spaced. The leaves cover the ground, but there's still loads of space between the squash plants, and so you can put sweet corn in there. And obviously, if you get your timings right, your sweet corn is kind of a few feet high by the time the squash has covered the whole of the ground, and so all the leaf area of the sweet corn is above the leaf area of the squash, and so they romp away, and they don't affect each other. Although obviously the sweet corn is pulling some water out of the ground that potentially the squash could access. but that's a small price to pay for all that extra food. So only a couple left. I really like cold frames. I think they're great. It's so easy to take the lids off and store them. They're so easy to vent. They're kind of great in all weathers. They really are fantastic for season extension. You can put mesh lids on them. You can put polythene lids on them. So, you know, they're just incredibly versatile. So I highly recommend, if you're going to start with a little bit of season extension, start with the cold frame. If you do well with the cold frame, get a little low tunnel. If you really like the low tunnel, get a high tunnel. Keep on going like that. If you can't afford anything, use fleece, and fleece is pretty good. And there's some nice alternatives now that are a little bit more hard wearing than the traditional fleece that seems to just disintegrate after a few months outside, and definitely disintegrates if you leave it anywhere in the sunshine in summer. It just degrades in UV light. And then finally, harvest a lot and harvest into water. So I think one of the things people do, they just don't harvest. They don't pick aggressively enough. So, you know, they might pick 1 or 2 leaves off something, whereas actually, you know, you could pick, say, 20-30% of the leaves, and then in 2 weeks' time you come back and they've all regrown, and you just keep on. You know, plants respond to being picked. The more you pick them, the more they grow. So just pick your plants a bit harder, get some more food, and harvest into water. We found this to be absolutely amazing. You know, if you get some nice cold water, and then every time you harvest, you know, pick something, just drop it into that water, leave it in the water until you're ready to pack it, and then pack it into airtight containers. We use these Addis containers that we got from Home Bargains. They're £1 each. This, you know, lovely and airtight. The food stays so fresh in these containers. Before you put them in, you need to spin them. You need to remove the surface water, and then just let them sit and just dry out a little bit for, well, it depends. You'd have to depends on how sunny it is, but between, say, 5 and 15 minutes or something like that, and then just drain any excess water out. So the leaves are going into the containers damp, so they come off the plant, they go into cold water. The cold water stops any degradation at all. In some cases it freshens the plant up even more. Then you spin it to dry it. We use one of those bags that you can put stuff in the washing machine in. So if you've got sort of delicates and you don't want those delicates mixed up, you can get these mesh bags, and they're quite big. So the ones we've got are about this sort of size, and you just spin them around your head like that, and that gets most of the water off, and then seal them up. And we find that almost everything lasts a full week, and it just tastes exactly the same as it did when it went in. We've even gone on holiday with a cool box full of salads and eaten a salad every day for 7 days, and on the 7th day, you know, it's still pretty good. So there you go. Can't remember how many tips that was. Definitely more than 10. But anyway, hope it's useful. I'll see you soon.